The lens that you choose will dramatically affect the outcome of your photos, affecting things like image sharpness, focal length, perspective, and your depth of field. And here on this channel, we're all about getting the best bang for our buck here. So let me tell you exactly what you need to know. So you have prime lenses and zoom lenses. Prime lenses are one focal length and typically they have a wider aperture, and zoom lenses are really good because of their versatility. It allows you to be able to shoot at multiple different focal lengths and not have to worry about changing lenses. With these two types of lenses, you have native lenses and then there's third-party options as well. So you have like a native Sony lens right here, but there's also third-party alternatives. What's the difference between a native lens and a third-party lens? Well, a native lens is going to integrate much better with that specific system. Third-party options out there are really good as well. Like right now I have a Sigma 24-70 on the camera right now. It's got really good autofocus and it talks to my camera the way that I need it to. Whenever you're working with third-party, sometimes the autofocus isn't going to be as good as it would be if it was an actual Sony lens. And with those native brands, you have your luxury line, which you have the Canon L series, and then for Sony, you have the Sony G Master. See that little guy right there? That's the focal length. This is a 70-200 zoom lens. And the focal length is a fixed property on the lens, so you can't change it at all. So if you have something like, let's say this is a 16mm prime lens by Sigma, a 16mm is going to be a wider focal length. So the lower this number is, the 16mm, the more wide that it's going to be. The higher the number is, like this 200 right here, that's going to be more of a tighter field of view. What's interesting about this 16mm Sigma lens is when you put it on a crop sensor body, you don't actually get a true 16mm. It actually has a 24mm field of view. And the reason that is because this sensor on this camera here, the crop sensor camera, has that smaller sensor. And because it has that smaller sensor, it only reads the center portion of what's inside of the lens. Now let's talk about the difference between full frame lenses and crop sensor lenses, so you can decide which one is best for you. Full frame lenses are designed to go on full frame cameras. So I have this 50mm full frame lens here. When I place this on a full frame camera, it's not only gonna have a 50mm focal length, but it's also going to have a 50mm field of view because you're taking advantage of the entire sensor. Crop lenses are designed for crop sensor cameras, which have a smaller sensor, and there's going to be some sort of a crop factor that's applied whenever you attach the lens to the camera. And for this Sony a6500, if I put this 16mm lens on it, it's going to have a 1.5 times crop. Some other crop sensor cameras are going to vary depending on like the sensor size and the distance between the lens and the actual sensor itself. When I go and look for lenses for this crop sensor camera, I'm gonna have to apply a 1.5 times crop to the focal length in order to get the actual field of view. So if I need to go wider than that, I need to make sure that I consider that 1.5 times crop. Crop sensor lenses are good too because they're more affordable and they're pretty sharp as well. Like I have the whole Sigma art lens, like up on my shelf back here. This is the 16mm, I have the 30mm and the 56mm lenses, and I shot some of my first weddings with just those three lenses. What's cool about Sony though is that I can take this full frame lens and attach it to a crop sensor body and vice versa, and it's still going to function just like it's supposed to. The only thing that changes when I put this full frame lens on this is that it's not going to get that 50mm focal length. It's going to have a 1.5 times crop to it. So do the math, leave it down in the comments. I don't know the math on the top of my head, but you can do this if you want to. You can also take a crop sensor lens and put it on a full frame camera. And the only downside is that you're going to lose some resolution. So if I put like this 16mm, what's going to happen is it will get that crop as well, in order to be able to make sure you don't have a bunch of vignetting around the actual frame of the shot. Once you put your camera in crop mode, it takes it down to like a 12 megapixel, I think, something like that, which is fine for like social media stuff. And so I can still get some pretty wide angle shots. And almost forgot to mention, you don't lose any quality whenever you put the full frame lens on the crop sensor camera. You just lose the 50mm field of view. A wide angle lens like a 16mm is gonna stretch things out and make them appear as though they're wider apart. And then a longer focal length like a 135mm or 105mm are going to compress things and make things seem like they're closer together. If you're doing close-up portraits of people, you may want to avoid using wider focal lengths because you're going to get all kinds of distortion and weird looking facial shapes and things like that. So you're better off going with something like a 50 millimeter or an 85 millimeter, or even up to like 105 millimeters. But there is extremes on the other end as well. So you don't want to go too wide, but you also don't want to go too tight because both ends are going to look unnatural. You could also use 35 millimeter if you want, but you're better off staying between that 50 millimeter to 105 millimeters, just in my experience. When you see photos that have some areas that are in focus and really sharp, and then others that are out of focus and have that blurry background, depth of field is what controls all of that. So longer focal lengths are gonna have a shallower depth of field, and wider focal lengths are gonna have a larger depth of field, which is just gonna allow for more things to be in focus. Depth of field is controlled by your aperture setting. And so if you have a wide aperture like f1.8, that means you're gonna have a more shallower depth of field, so you're gonna have more blurry background. But if you have a tighter aperture like f16, that means you're gonna have a more narrow depth of field and less things that are gonna be blurry in the background. So I'm gonna try not to touch the glass and still keep things in focus, but the aperture is inside of the lens here. And that's what I mean when I say this little opening gets wider, and that's going to allow for more light to come in. But as that gets wider, that number is gonna go down. So if it's all the way open for this lens, it's gonna be at f1.8, but as it gets tighter, that opening closes, you're gonna be at more like something like f16 or the max aperture for this lens. And that means that you're gonna have almost everything's gonna be in focus. Some other features that are important to me are, first, sharpness. You're not gonna get a whole lot of sharpness out of using something like this. This is one of the Sony kit lenses that comes with the camera. This thing, not sharp at all. You're better off getting yourself something like a little nifty 50, which is like, this is like, if you buy this during the holidays, it's like 150 bucks. It's really inexpensive, and you can start taking some really high quality photos. I use this right now. This is a 50 millimeter 1.8. You can find similar ones with other brands. They're all gonna be in a similar price range. Get yourself one of these. It's gonna be much sharper than utilizing the kit lens that came with your camera. Another thing that's important to me, it may not be important to everyone, is does the lens have autofocus? And how good is the autofocus? Because if you have a third-party lens that you're looking at, but the reviews say that the autofocus isn't very great, may not be the best option depending on what you're going out there and trying to photograph. But just keep in mind that there are some lenses that only have manual focus. So if autofocus is important to you, make sure that the lens that you're picking has that capability. Also, if you're gonna be shooting in like inclement weather where there's gonna be snow or rain, you don't really ever know. So I always just like to make sure that I get something that is weather sealed too. How do I decide on which lens I should buy? First, look at what your needs are as a photographer. Are you wanting to do portraits? Or you want to do landscapes? Are you shooting wildlife? And then that will help you kind of narrow down, because you're like, essentially you're just picking a niche. Once you have somewhat of an idea of what your niche is gonna be, I'm not saying you have to commit or specialize in anything. Just narrowing things down makes it a little bit easier. I would then look at what your budget is. Now, regardless of what your budget is, you gotta test the lens before you buy it. Now, you can do this by going to a camera shop, but if you're someone like me that doesn't have a camera shop that's really close, you could definitely rent it. I would rather rent a lens because you can rent one for like less than $100 for a day. That way you're getting a good idea of all the ins and outs of that lens and if it's gonna work for your specific workflow. I just realized as I'm editing this video that I didn't say anything about buying used lenses. I bought used lenses before because I didn't have the budget to buy the newer option. There's always gonna be risk associated with buying something that's used, but typically what happens if you were to buy like a used lens on B&H's website, it goes through an inspection process before it actually goes up for sale. So if you're buying from a credible source like B&H, you're gonna be a lot safer, and it's gonna be a lot cheaper for you to buy something used versus buying it new. You also wanna decide on like, do you wanna be changing lenses all the time? Because if you don't wanna change lenses all the time, then a prime lens may not be the right lens for you. I like prime lenses because you get that lower aperture that goes nice and wide, but like I was saying earlier, that 24-70 is really good whenever you're just needing to zoom around all over the place and not having to have the hassle of swapping lenses all the time. So here's some of my favorite lenses. So I already spoke about the Nifty 50 here, the 50 millimeter f1.8. You could get the 1.2, or you could get the 1.4. They're gonna be a lot more expensive, but if you're just getting started, this is a perfectly good lens for portraits and things like that. My workhorse is the Sigma 24-70. That thing goes with me everywhere, weddings, landscapes. Like I just took that thing with me up to Wyoming a few months ago and took some crazy looking landscapes because it just captures like wide angle shots. You can capture portraits too. So it gets it all done, and honestly, it can make you pretty lazy, so maybe it's not the best thing to get a 24-70 and only rely on that. Another favorite, which is a little expensive, but totally worth it, is the 70-200, because I shoot weddings, and if you've ever shot weddings or events, you know that having a 70-200 gives you that reach that just makes things so much easier, and you know you're gonna get the shots that you need to get, and you're not gonna be in the way. Always try to make sure, if I don't have this, you could definitely rent one of these. Now, none of the things that I mentioned in this video matter if you don't know what camera to buy. So watch this video next, and I'll see you there. Full frame, the lens that you choose,